By the summer of 1943, the Allies had already learned that modern war could kill their own men just as efficiently as the enemy could. The danger was not only the German guns, the German bombs, or the German tanks. It was the fact that their own system was becoming so large, so fast, and so complicated that it could turn on itself in a single night. The first time this truth exploded into view, it happened over Sicily in the dark, above a sea full of ships and a sky full of men who believed they were flying into safety. The invasion of Sicily was supposed to be a turning point. Allied commanders had opened the campaign with confidence, believing that air power and naval firepower would create confusion, overwhelm the enemy, and speed the collapse of the island. The plan looked clean on paper. Aircraft would carry reinforcements to the battlefield. The fleet offshore would support the landings. Every branch of the operation would know its role. But war does not care about diagrams. It cares about weather, fear, fatigue, bad timing, and human beings making decisions with incomplete information. And on that night, all of those weaknesses came together. The American transport planes approached Sicily, carrying paratroopers from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. These were not inexperienced men. They were trained soldiers who had done everything that had been asked of them. They had boarded their aircraft, expecting to land behind enemy lines and help secure the invasion. The pilots believed the route was clear. The men aboard trusted that the system around them had been checked. But below them, the Allied fleet had already spent the day under repeated German air attack. Ships had been hit by waves of enemy bombers. Gunners had been firing for hours. They were tired, stressed, and ready to shoot at anything that appeared in the sky. That was the perfect condition for disaster. When the first transport crossed the coast around 10:20 in the evening, one ship opened fire. That single act was enough. Once one gun crew fired, the rest of the fleet reacted almost immediately. Tracers cut into the darkness, searchlights flashed. Anti-aircraft guns opened across the armada. The transport planes were low, slow, and loaded with soldiers. They had no meaningful armor and no real defensive weapons. They were large, vulnerable targets, moving through a sky that had suddenly become a killing field. The men inside those aircraft could do almost nothing. They were passengers in the worst possible sense. Some pilots tried to keep formation. Others broke away when the shooting became too intense. One plane caught fire and went down into the sea, trailing flame behind it. Men were thrown from the fuselage. Some burned before they hit the water. Others tried to survive in the darkness under the weight of their gear. In some cases, paratroopers were dropped far from their intended landing zones because pilots trying to escape the fire released them wherever they could. That scattered soldiers across miles of countryside instead of dropping them where the invasion needed them most. The disaster did not end there. Some paratroopers landed in the sea and drowned under their equipment. Others were shot while hanging in their parachutes. In the confusion, several pilots turned back to Tunisia, still carrying their full loads, unwilling to risk continuing into the storm of fire below. By the time the operation was over, the scale of the failure was undeniable. Aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded. The skies above Sicily had become a place where Allied soldiers were dying because their own side could not recognize them in time. What made Sicily more important than the raw numbers was what it exposed. This was not a single mistake made by one confused gunner. It was a structural failure. The fleet had not been fully informed. The warning had not reached everyone, or had reached them too late, or had been understood too badly to matter. The aircraft and the ships were part of the same operation, but they were not truly sharing the same reality. The sky above Sicily proved that an army can have enormous power and still lack the one thing that matters most in combat: a fast, reliable way for every part of the machine to understand what the others are doing. The lesson was obvious, but it was also dangerous. If commanders admitted the truth too openly, they would be admitting that modern coalition warfare could fail at the most basic level. So they tried to solve the problem quickly and visibly. If gunners could not reliably identify friendly aircraft at night, then the answer would be to make the aircraft impossible to confuse. Allied planners turned to a simple but dramatic solution: invasion stripes. 5 bold bands, painted black and white around the wings and fuselage, designed to be seen instantly from the ground and from the air. It was a low-tech answer to a high-tech problem, and in this case, it actually worked. Ground crews across southern England worked through the night before Normandy, painting the stripes onto Allied tactical aircraft. The process was rushed, messy, and often crude. Men used brushes, rollers, rags, and whatever they had at hand. The finished markings were ugly up close, but that was never the point. They were supposed to be unmistakable. If a ship crew or a ground gunner saw those stripes, they would know the aircraft was friendly. And for that specific problem, the solution succeeded. Over Normandy, the stripes helped reduce the kind of confusion that had killed so many men over Sicily. But the success was partial. And partial success is often dangerous in war because it creates confidence faster than it creates safety. The stripes solved identity. They did nothing for precision. They could tell a gunner what not to shoot. They could not tell a bomber crew exactly where to release its load when friendly troops were only a few hundred yards away. The war in Normandy would expose that problem in a far more painful way. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion had moved inland, but the fighting had become a grinding nightmare. Normandy was not open country. It was a maze of hedgerows, small fields, sunken lanes, ruined villages, and hidden German positions. Every field was a trap. Every road could become a kill zone. The German defenders understood that the terrain worked in their favor, and they used it to slow the advance to a brutal crawl. The Allies had air superiority, but air superiority did not automatically translate into battlefield clarity. The men on the ground were asking for help. The commanders above them wanted a breakthrough. The bombers were being pushed into a role they were never truly built for. That was the next lesson the war was about to teach them. The problem was no longer just whether a ship could tell a friendly plane from an enemy one. The problem was whether a plane could hit the enemy without hitting its own men. And that was a much harder problem to solve. By the summer of 1944, the Allies were no longer fighting a neat war on a clean map. They were trapped in a battlefield that punished distance, visibility, and hesitation all at once. Normandy had turned into a maze of hedgerows, narrow roads, ruined villages, and hidden German positions. From above, it looked like farmland. On the ground, it was a trap. Every field could hide machine guns, anti-tank weapons, or infantry, waiting to open fire the moment Allied troops moved forward. The soldiers in the mud needed air power to break the deadlock. The air commanders wanted to give it to them. But the very thing that made the Allied Air Force so powerful also made it dangerous. Once the bombers were in motion, they were too far away to understand the battlefield the way the men below did. The first major test of this problem came when British commanders tried to smash the German position east of Caen in Operation Goodwood. The scale of the attack was enormous. More than 2,000 aircraft were committed. Thousands of tons of bombs were dropped. From the perspective of the planners, this should have been the kind of strike that broke the German line wide open. Instead, the operation exposed the limits of heavy bombing and close support. The crews were terrified of dropping too close to their own troops, so the bombs were released farther back than ideal. That choice was understandable. No commander wanted to repeat a friendly fire disaster. But the result was that the most dangerous German guns survived the strike. What followed was a brutal lesson in the difference between force and precision. The bombers had created destruction, but not the right destruction. They had shattered parts of the battlefield, but they had left key German defenses intact. When British tanks moved forward, they ran straight into those surviving positions. German 88mm guns, hidden and waiting, opened fire on the advancing armor. Tank crews watched vehicles burn. Men climbed out of damaged tanks, only to be caught in machine gun fire. What had been sold as a crushing blow became a reminder that massive air power could still fail if it could not land with enough accuracy where it mattered most. That failure was not random, it came from fear. The pilots had been told, directly or indirectly, that they must not hit Allied troops. They obeyed that instruction, but in obeying it, they created a different danger. The bombs fell short of the point where they were actually needed. In the language of war, that is not a small mistake. It is the difference between breaking an enemy line and leaving it alive. Goodwood showed that the Allies could gather overwhelming force and still fail to use it in a way that matched the reality on the ground. The deeper problem was that the air war and the ground war were speaking different languages. A bomber crew at altitude saw broad shapes, smoke patterns, and target markers. An infantry unit in a hedgerow saw a ditch, a wall, a field, and a German gun 30 yards away. The airmen were thinking in terms of zones. The soldiers were thinking in terms of meters. That mismatch became deadly when the Allies tried to use bombers as a direct tool of breakthrough. The aircraft were built to hit large targets from far away. Normandy demanded something much tighter, much faster, and much harder to control. That was the background for Operation Cobra, the American breakout attempt near St. Lo. General Omar Bradley wanted a concentrated strike that would punch a hole in the German front line and finally let the American advance move into open country. He did not want another broad, vague bombing raid. He wanted a specific section of the enemy line destroyed at the exact right moment. The plan looked careful on paper. The ground troops were pulled back as close as Bradley dared. The bombers were assigned a narrow target area. The whole attack depended on timing, coordination, and trust. If the bombers hit the right place, the offensive could begin. If they drifted, the results could be catastrophic. And that is where the system failed again. The bombers came in over the battlefield in formation, and the formation itself became part of the problem. A damaged aircraft jettisoned its bombs early. The crews behind it saw the release and interpreted it as confirmation that the target had been found. They dropped too. Then, the next crews followed the same pattern. The mistake spread backward through the formation, almost like a chain reaction. What should have been one controlled bombing run turned into a cascading error. Bombs began to fall farther and farther from the intended line. The target area was lost inside a wave of confusion. On the ground, the effect was immediate. Some bombs struck German positions, but others landed on Allied troops waiting behind the line. Units that had been told to stay in place suddenly found themselves under fire from the sky. Headquarters areas were hit. Vehicles were destroyed. Men were killed and wounded in places that were supposed to be safe. The strike that had been designed to open the path forward instead tore into the rear of the Allied position. This was not the same kind of failure as Goodwood. Goodwood had been too cautious. Cobra was too brittle. In one case, the bombers refused to go close enough. In the other, they lost control of the pattern once the attack began. The real lesson was that the Allied system had become too large for the battlefield it was trying to dominate. The bombers were supposed to support the troops, but they were too far away to see the ground clearly. The ground troops were supposed to trust the air attack, but they had no direct way to correct it once it started. The commanders planned with maps. The crews flew through smoke, dust, and flak. The soldiers below waited with their lives, exposed to decisions made hundreds or thousands of feet above them. In that kind of system, a single mistake could spread faster than anyone could stop it. What made Cobra especially important was that it proved the problem was not only one of caution. Even when the Allies tried to be precise, even when they narrowed the target, even when they timed the attack carefully, the system could still break under pressure. The formation logic that made mass bombing efficient also made it vulnerable to cascade failure. One wrong release could alter the whole run. One damaged plane could mislead the crews behind it. One gap in communication could turn a planned strike into a disaster. The machine was powerful, but it was not flexible enough to guarantee safety when the battlefield became crowded and fast. For the men on the ground, that meant living under a strange and terrible form of uncertainty. They could not simply fear the Germans. They also had to fear the bombers that were supposed to help them. That changed the psychology of the war. A soldier under enemy fire knows where the threat is coming from. A soldier under friendly fire does not know whether to trust the sky. Once that trust is broken, every future operation becomes harder. Every bomber overhead feels less like rescue and more like a test. By the end of Cobra, the Allies had not solved the problem. They had only discovered how many ways it could fail. The war in Normandy was forcing them to learn the same lesson over and over again. Power without control can be just as dangerous as weakness. And the next time they tried to force a breakthrough with air power, the consequences would be even more painful. Understood. Here's Chapter 3 in the same style, written cleanly for voiceover, with the focus on tension, logic, and escalation. By the time the Allies reached the next stage of the Normandy campaign, they were no longer dealing with one isolated mistake. They were dealing with a pattern that kept repeating under different conditions. The first lesson had been about recognition. The second had been about precision. The third would be about something even more dangerous. What happens when a system built for mass power starts making decisions faster than the people inside it can understand? The pressure to break through in Normandy had become unbearable. The invasion had succeeded, but the campaign was not moving the way Allied commanders had expected. The German defense held on longer than it should have. The hedgerows kept slowing the advance. Every mile cost lives. Every delay gave the enemy time to regroup. So the answer, once again, was to call in more air power, more planes, more bombs, more force. But now, the commanders were trying to use that force, not just to harass the enemy, but to create a real opening in the front line. That meant the next operation had to be more exact than anything before it. The target was no longer a broad area. It was a narrow strip of German defenses. The idea was simple in theory. Hit one specific section hard enough, and the ground forces could move through the gap before the Germans recovered. But this kind of plan only works if every part of it behaves correctly. The bombers had to arrive on time. The formation had to stay coordinated. The ground troops had to remain in the right place. The safe zone had to be respected, and the crews in the air had to trust that the men below were exactly where the map said they would be. That was the weakness. The map was not the battlefield. The men in the bombers did not see trenches, hedgerows, scattered units, smoke, confusion, and sudden movement. They saw a target line, markers, and the aircraft ahead of them. They could not talk directly to the infantry. They could not stop and ask whether the front line had shifted. They had to rely on timing and formation logic. If the lead aircraft released its bombs, the others followed. If one crew dropped early, the crews behind might treat that as proof that the run was on course. In a system like that, a single mistake could spread through the entire attack before anyone on the ground even understood what had happened. That is exactly what made the bombing disaster so catastrophic. One damaged aircraft began the chain. It jettisoned its load early. The crews behind it saw the bombs fall and believed the target had been reached. They dropped too. Then the next crews did the same. The error moved backward through the formation, each crew trusting the one in front of it more than the actual battlefield below. By the time the mistake became obvious, the bomb pattern was already collapsing. The result was devastating. Bombs that were supposed to hit German positions landed too far back. Some struck Allied troops who had been waiting for the attack to finish. Others fell on support units and command areas behind the line. Men who had spent days preparing for the breakthrough were suddenly running for cover from their own bombs. Vehicles burned, headquarters were hit. Units lost order and direction in the middle of an offensive that depended on perfect timing. The strike that was supposed to open the way forward instead turned into another reminder that the Allies could not fully control the machine they had built. This was worse than simple failure. It was a failure of trust. Once soldiers see their own air power strike the wrong place, they begin to fear every future attack. They cannot easily believe that the next bombing run will be the one that works. And when that fear spreads, it changes the way the whole army fights. Men hesitate at the moment they should move. They question the timing of support that was supposed to be reliable. They survive one disaster, but carry the knowledge that the same thing could happen again at any time. The deepest problem was that the air war and the ground war were operating on different scales. A bomber crew at altitude saw broad movement and general patterns. The infantry saw individual fields, roads, walls, and enemy guns hidden only a short distance away. The planners wanted the bombers to act like a giant hammer that could clear a path instantly. But the battlefield in Normandy was too crowded, too fragmented, and too close for that kind of clean solution. The bombers were powerful enough to create shock, but not close enough to understand the exact shape of the fight. That distance made them dangerous. By this point, the Allies should have understood that they were asking too much of one system. They wanted strategic aircraft to behave like precise artillery. They wanted massive formations to remain perfectly aligned in a battle zone that was constantly shifting. They wanted the speed of air power and the accuracy of ground combat at the same time. But war does not reward wishful thinking. It rewards the side that understands the limits of its own tools. And the Allies were still learning those limits at a terrible cost. The men on the ground paid for those lessons directly. They had to keep moving under the shadow of aircraft they could not control. They had to trust that the strike would land where it was intended. They had to accept that the same force that could break German defenses could also destroy them if something went wrong. That is what made these operations so unnerving. The enemy was dangerous, but at least the enemy was expected. Friendly fire was worse because it broke the basic structure of trust that soldiers need to keep going. And the worst part was that the system encouraged confidence right before the disaster. Every correction made the planners feel closer to safety. Every new procedure made the next strike seem more reliable. But the war kept changing faster than the rules. One fix addressed the last mistake. It did not stop the next one. So the Allied command moved forward with plans that looked improved on paper, while the battlefield below kept revealing new ways for those plans to fail. That is where the story now stands. The Allies have learned that identification can fail. They have learned that precision can fail. They have learned that a carefully timed bombing run can still collapse when the formation itself begins to misread its own signals. The next step will show that even after all of these lessons, the system is still vulnerable to one final truth. The larger the machine becomes, the harder it is to stop once it starts moving in the wrong direction. By the time the final phase of this story arrived, the Allied command in Normandy was already trapped inside a terrible contradiction. They had built a war machine powerful enough to crush almost anything it could reach, but not precise enough to use that power safely when its own troops were close to the target. Every time they thought they had solved the problem, the next operation proved that they had only solved the last version of it. The battlefield kept changing. The machine kept pushing forward, and the men inside it kept paying the price. The pressure to break the German line was intense. Normandy had stopped looking like a quick invasion and started looking like a brutal grinding match. The hedgerows were still there. The villages were still fortified. The roads were still narrow and dangerous. The Germans, even under heavy pressure, were not collapsing fast enough to give the Allies the easy breakthrough they had hoped for. That meant the commanders were pushed back toward the same answer again and again. Use more air power, drop more bombs, create more shock, force the enemy to break. But by now, everyone should have understood the cost of asking too much from aircraft that could not see the battlefield the way the soldiers below did. The next operation was supposed to be more controlled, more decisive, and more intelligent than the earlier ones. It had to be. The Allies were no longer trying to simply damage the German position. They were trying to tear open the front line itself and create a gap large enough for the ground forces to exploit immediately. That kind of plan leaves almost no room for error. The bombers had to strike in the right place. They had to strike at the right time. The troops below had to be positioned exactly where the planners believed they were. And every crew in the air had to behave as though the formation in front of them was a perfect guide. In a real battlefield, none of those assumptions could be guaranteed. That was the central weakness. The system depended on chain reactions. The aircraft at the front released first. The aircraft behind them followed. The rest of the formation read those actions as confirmation. The ground troops waited for the strike to finish, trusting that the air attack would open the path. Everyone was locked into the same sequence, but almost nobody had direct control over what happened next. One damaged bomber could change the timing. One confused crew could shift the line. One early release could ripple backward through the formation and turn a planned strike into a disaster before anyone could correct it. That is exactly what happened when the attack went wrong. A damaged aircraft began the chain by jettisoning its bombs early. The crews behind it saw the release and assumed the lead plane had found the target. They dropped too. Then, the next crews followed the same pattern. The mistake spread like a signal, moving through a line of people who trusted the person ahead of them more than the actual situation below. What should have been a tight, controlled bombing run became a cascading failure. Bombs started falling farther and farther from the intended line. Some landed behind the German positions. Some landed on Allied troops who were waiting for the strike to end so they could move forward. Some struck command and support areas in the rear. On the ground, the effect was horrifying. The men who had been told to expect help from above suddenly found themselves under attack from their own side. Explosions ripped across areas that were supposed to be safe. Vehicles burned. Men were thrown to the ground. Units lost their shape. Officers tried to understand what had gone wrong, while the battlefield around them filled with smoke and panic. The most dangerous part of the disaster was not only the physical damage, it was the collapse of trust. Once soldiers see their own air force hit the wrong place, every future bombing run becomes a source of fear. The sky is no longer only a place of support. It becomes a place where another error might come falling out of it at any moment. That psychological shift mattered just as much as the casualties. War depends on confidence. Soldiers need to believe that the support behind them will arrive when promised and land where promised. If that belief disappears, the entire offensive becomes harder to sustain. Men hesitate. Commanders second guess. Timetables become uncertain. Even a successful attack can be shadowed by the fear that the next one will fail in exactly the same way. The enemy does not need to win every exchange if the Allied system begins to undermine itself. The real tragedy was that this was not a simple story of carelessness. The Allied commanders were not reckless fools. They were trying to solve an incredibly hard problem under extreme pressure. They had an enemy line to break, ground troops to support, and a campaign that could stall if they failed. Their choices often made sense in isolation. More force, better timing, better markings, better coordination. But each solution was aimed at the wrong scale. They kept trying to improve individual parts of the process, while the process itself remained fundamentally disconnected. The bomber crews at altitude were far from the troops below. They saw smoke, markers, and formations, but not the exact shape of the fight. The infantry on the ground saw hedgerows, tanks, guns, and enemy movement in close detail, but they could not directly correct the bombers once they were airborne. The headquarters tried to bridge the gap, but the gap was too wide. Information moved too slowly. The battlefield moved too quickly. By the time a mistake became obvious in one part of the system, the aircraft were already releasing in another. That is why this story is so powerful. It is not only about one disaster or one operation. It is about a war machine discovering that its own scale had become part of the problem. The Allies had built air power to deliver overwhelming force. They had learned how to use it to dominate the sky, strike deep into enemy territory, and support a massive invasion. But when they tried to use that same machine in a crowded battlefield at close range, it turned dangerous. It could not always tell the difference between the enemy and the men standing just beyond the target line. It could not always stop once a formation started its run. It could not always adapt fast enough to what was happening below. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the lesson had become unavoidable. Air power was not useless. It remained one of the most important tools in the Allied arsenal. But it was not a perfect answer. It could win wars at a distance. It could break industrial systems, disrupt supply lines, and crush enemy positions in the open. What it could not do reliably was replace direct battlefield judgment when the margin for error was measured in yards and seconds. The bombers were too powerful to ignore, and too blunt to trust blindly. The men who survived these operations carried that lesson for the rest of their lives. They knew what it meant to stand under a sky that could kill you even when it belonged to your own side. They knew what it meant to wait for support and then see the wrong bombs fall. They knew that battlefield success is not just about having more weapons. It is about using those weapons with enough precision, communication, and restraint that the system does not eat its own soldiers. And that is the final truth at the center of this story. The Allies did not lose because they lacked strength. They almost lost men because they had too much strength for a system that could not always control it. Sicily showed them the danger of identity failure. Normandy showed them the danger of precision failure. The repeated disasters showed them that every fix could still leave the deeper problem untouched. In war, the most dangerous flaw is often not weakness. It is confidence in a machine that has already begun to fail. That is what makes these events unforgettable. Not that they happened once, but that they kept happening in different forms until the war itself forced the lesson home. The sky could help win the battle. It could also destroy the men it came to save.